It started with the faint rumble of thunder somewhere in the distance, like an ominous whisper from the approaching storm. I sat on the couch, flipping through TV channels, trying to tune out the persistent flashes of lightning outside. The storm had rolled in faster than I expected, and it brought a strange tension that I couldn't quite place. I live alone in a small rental house on the outskirts of town. It's not remote, but the neighbors are spread out, and the thick cluster of trees behind my backyard makes it feel more secluded than it is. Nights like these always made me uneasy, not because of the storm itself, but because of how it seemed to amplify every sound. The creak of a floorboard, the groan of the wind pushing against the walls. It all felt louder, more deliberate. By 9 p.m., the storm was in full swing. Sheets of rain lashed against the windows, and the lightning turned the backyard into a strobe-lit scene of swaying trees and dark shadows. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when the power suddenly cut out, plunging the house into darkness, I wasn't too concerned. Power outages were common here during heavy storms. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and lit a few candles, setting them on the coffee table. Then I heard it. A soft knock at the back door. It wasn't forceful or frantic, more like a polite tap, as if someone was just announcing their presence. I froze, gripping the flashlight tighter. My first thought was that it was the wind, but the knock came again, more insistent this time. I slowly made my way to the kitchen, where the back door led out to the yard. I couldn't see anyone through the rain-streaked glass, but that didn't mean much. The storm made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. The wind and rain drowned out any response, if there was one. Another knock. 3 soft taps. This time, it sent a shiver down my spine. I decided against opening the door. Instead, I turned off the flashlight and moved back into the living room, hoping that whoever, or whatever, was out there would lose interest. For a few moments, I thought I'd made the right decision. The knocking stopped, and all I could hear was the relentless storm outside. Then, I saw the shadow. It was tall and stretched across the living room wall, faintly illuminated by the flickering candles. It moved, slow and deliberate, across the room, heading towards the front of the house. I turned sharply towards the window, but all I could see was darkness and rain. My heart was pounding now, the flashlight trembling in my grip. I wanted to believe it was just the branches of the tree outside, caught in the wind, but something about the way the shadow moved didn't feel natural. It wasn't chaotic or random. It had purpose. A loud crash from the backyard made me jump. It sounded like something heavy had fallen or been thrown against the house. I bolted to the kitchen again, peering cautiously out the back door. The yard was empty, but the storm had somehow grown louder, the wind howling like a wounded animal. I decided to call someone, anyone, but when I reached for my phone, I realized I'd left it charging in the bedroom. As I moved through the hallway, another noise stopped me in my tracks, a faint scraping, like nails or metal dragging against the siding of the house. It was coming from the front now, near the porch. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. Something deep in my gut told me I didn't want to see whatever was out there. The sound moved again, this time towards the side of the house. It was deliberate, circling, like a predator toying with its prey. I reached the bedroom and grabbed my phone, but the screen was blank, dead. The power outage had killed the charge. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my mind racing. I needed a plan, but every option felt like a gamble. I could barricade myself in the bedroom, but if someone, or something, was determined enough, it wouldn't stop them. I could make a run for the neighbor's house, but that would mean braving the storm and whatever was out there in the dark. Before I could decide, the knocking returned. This time, it came from the window right outside the bedroom. 3 soft taps, deliberate and mocking. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned towards the window, the flashlight beam trembling as it landed on the glass. The window was fogged up from the cold rain outside, but there was no mistaking the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. For what felt like an eternity, I stared at the hand pressed against the window. It wasn't moving, just lingering there as if whoever it belonged to wanted me to know they were there. My body screamed at me to move, to run, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sight. Then, the hand pulled back, disappearing into the darkness beyond the glass. My breath caught as I waited, flashlight aimed at the window, but nothing happened. No more knocks, no movement. Just the relentless storm outside. It would have been a relief if it didn't feel so much like a calm before the storm. I needed to get out of the house. Staying here was no longer an option. I grabbed my car keys from the bedside table, threw on my jacket, and decided to make a dash for the front door. If I could just make it to my car, I could drive to the nearest gas station or somewhere safe. I didn't care about the storm anymore. Whatever was out there couldn't be worse than the feeling of being trapped inside this house. I made my way back down the hallway, careful to avoid the windows, and reached the living room. As I approached the front door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The candles on the coffee table had all been blown out. The room was pitch black now, save for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the walls. I hadn't heard anyone come in, but the extinguished candles told a different story. Fumbling with the lock, I opened the front door and was immediately hit by the force of the storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind was so strong it nearly pulled the door out of my hands. I stepped onto the porch, squinting through the downpour, and scanned the yard for any signs of movement. The world outside was chaos. The trees swayed violently, and the rain blurred everything beyond a few feet. I could barely make out the outline of my car in the driveway, but it might as well have been a mile away. I hesitated for a moment, then steeled myself. I had no choice but to make a run for it. I bolted down the porch steps and into the storm, the rain soaking me instantly. My feet splashed through puddles as I sprinted towards the car, my eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement in the periphery. I reached the driver's side door and yanked it open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, I felt safe. The sound of the rain pounding against the roof drowned out everything else, and the interior of the car felt like a sanctuary. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally managed to start the engine. The headlights came on, illuminating the driveway, and something else. Standing at the edge of the light was a figure, tall, motionless, and shrouded in rain. Their face was obscured by the storm, but they were close enough that I could see the outline of their body, soaked and still. My breath hitched as the figure took a step forward, slowly, deliberately. Then another step. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires skidding on the wet gravel as I backed out of the driveway. The figure didn't chase me. They just stood there, watching, as I sped down the road. The rain made it nearly impossible to see, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I drove aimlessly, not sure where I was going, until I spotted the glow of a gas station sign through the storm. Relief flooded me as I pulled into the lot and parked under the awning. The sound of rain replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights. The attendant inside gave me a strange look as I stumbled in, drenched and shaking. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words came out jumbled and incoherent. He just nodded slowly and let me use the phone to call the police. When the officers arrived, I took them back to my house, though I was terrified of what they might find. The storm had started to let up by then, the rain reduced to a light drizzle. The house looked the same as I had left it, dark and unassuming, as if nothing had happened. The police searched the property and found no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence of anyone having been there. They assured me it was probably just my imagination, a trick of the storm and the power outage. But I knew better. The next day, when I returned to the house to collect some things, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the back door, just below the handle, were faint scratch marks, long and deep, as if made by claws. And etched into the condensation on the bedroom window, barely visible in the daylight, were 3 words, "See you soon." It was the kind of storm that made you feel like the world was trying to tear itself apart. Lightning forked across the sky every few seconds, illuminating the empty highway in stark, unnatural bursts. The wipers on my car were useless against the torrential rain, and the sound of it hammering against the roof was deafening. I was driving home from a work trip, a 4-hour drive that had stretched into 6 because of the weather. The road was deserted. No surprise, considering most people would have had the sense to stay off the highways during a storm like this. But I was stubborn. I wanted to sleep in my own bed, and I figured if I took it slow, I'd be fine. The GPS told me I was still an hour from home when I saw the flashers. A car was pulled off to the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly in the storm. As I passed, I could just make out the shape of a person standing by the open hood, waving their arms. They looked desperate. I'm not the kind of person who ignores someone in trouble. Even in a storm like this, I couldn't just drive past. I pulled over a little ahead of them and grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment. The rain hit me like a wall as I stepped out, instantly soaking through my jacket. I jogged back towards the car, my boots splashing through puddles. The figure by the car turned towards me as I approached. A man, probably in his mid-40s, wearing a poncho that was doing a poor job of keeping him dry. "Hey!" I shouted over the roar of the rain. "You need help?" "Thank God," he called back, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "My car died. Battery, I think. Can you give me a jump?" "Yeah, no problem," I said. "Let me grab the cables from my trunk." As I turned to head back to my car, a bolt of lightning lit up the sky, and for a split second, I saw something behind him. A shadow, darker than the night, standing just a few feet away. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving me frozen in place. "What's wrong?" the man shouted, his voice tinged with urgency. I shook my head, forcing myself to move. "Nothing. Just thought I saw. Never mind." I ran back to my car. The image of that shadow burned into my mind. It didn't make sense. It had been too solid, too distinct, to be a trick of the light. But the storm had a way of playing with your senses, and I told myself it was just my imagination. I popped the trunk and pulled out the jumper cables, then jogged back to the man's car. He was waiting by the hood, and as I hooked up the cables, I kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see that shadow again. Nothing. We got his car started without any trouble, and he shook my hand, thanking me profusely. I nodded, forcing a smile, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "You sure you'll be okay now?" I asked, glancing nervously at the surrounding darkness. "Yeah, I'll be fine," he said. "You take care, all right?" I nodded again and hurried back to my car, eager to put some distance between myself and whatever weirdness had just happened. As I drove away, I couldn't help but check the rearview mirror every few seconds. The road behind me was empty. The rest of the drive was uneventful until I got home. I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine, sitting in the car for a moment to catch my breath. The storm was still raging, the rain coming down in sheets and the wind rattling the windows. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and made a dash for the front door, fumbling with the keys as the rain soaked me to the bone. Once inside, I peeled off my wet jacket and shoes, tossing them in the corner. The house was quiet, too quiet, but I chalked it up to the contrast between the storm outside and the stillness inside. I was too tired to care. I was halfway up the stairs when the power went out. The sudden darkness was like a slap in the face. I froze, one hand on the banister, my other hand instinctively reaching for my phone. The flashlight beam was shaky as I shone it around the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock at the front door. I turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The door was in plain view from where I stood, and through the frosted glass, I could see the faint outline of a figure. My first thought was that it was the man from the highway, maybe needing more help, but as I descended the stairs and got closer to the door, something about the silhouette struck me as wrong. It was too tall, too thin, and it wasn't moving. It just stood there, perfectly still, as if waiting. I hesitated, then called out, "Hello?" No response. Another knock, soft but insistent. I approached the door cautiously, my flashlight aimed at the frosted glass. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat as I reached for the doorknob. But as soon as my hand touched the cool metal, there was a flash of lightning outside, and I caught a glimpse of the figure's face. Or rather, the lack of it. The lightning illuminated the figure for just a fraction of a second, but that was all it took for the image to burn itself into my mind. Where its face should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, featureless, expressionless, blank. I stumbled back from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, casting erratic beams of light across the walls. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The knocking came again, louder this time, and somehow more demanding. It wasn't frantic, but it carried a rhythm, like the figure knew it had all the time in the world. I bent down, fumbling for the flashlight, and aimed it back at the door. Through the frosted glass, I could see the shadow still standing there, unmoving. I wanted to scream, but fear had stolen my voice. Instead, I backed away slowly, one hand gripping the banister as I edged towards the stairs. The moment I took my first step up, the knocking stopped. Silence. For a fleeting second, I thought it was over. Maybe whoever, or whatever, it was had left. But then I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak coming from the back of the house. The back door. I cursed under my breath, realizing I'd forgotten to lock it in my haste to get inside. My mind raced with options, but none of them seemed like a good idea. If I went back downstairs, I'd risk coming face to face with whatever had just entered. If I stayed upstairs, I'd trap myself with nowhere to run. A low thud echoed through the house, followed by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. My skin prickled as they grew louder, moving through the kitchen and into the hallway. Each step was measured, purposeful, as if whoever, or whatever, was walking wanted me to hear them. I backed into my bedroom and locked the door, my hands trembling as I braced a chair under the handle. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind howling as rain pelted against the windows. I tried to steady my breathing, but every sound outside felt like it was being echoed inside the house. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside my bedroom door. I stared at the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The silence was unbearable, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it all. But then came the knock. Soft, deliberate, just like before. I wanted to shout, to tell it to leave, but I was too terrified to make a sound. Instead, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed 911. My hands shook as I brought the phone to my ear, but all I heard was static. I glanced at the screen and saw the dreaded words, "No signal." The knock came again, and this time, I swore I heard a voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. I backed away from the door, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline, and pressed myself against the far wall. Lightning flashed again, filling the room with blinding light. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow outside the bedroom window, but when the light faded, it was gone. I was trapped, cornered, with no way out. The doorknob rattled, and I heard the soft scrape of metal against wood as the chair bracing the door shifted slightly. My mind raced as I searched the room for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing, just the oppressive dark and the sound of the storm outside. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The knocking, the rattling, the footsteps, everything went silent. I waited, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing, only the sound of rain and thunder outside. Minutes passed like hours, and I finally gathered the courage to approach the door. Slowly, I removed the chair and unlocked it, cracking it open just enough to peek into the hallway. It was empty. I crept down the stairs, my ears straining for any sound, but the house was eerily still. The front door was closed, and the back door, to my surprise, was locked. I checked every room, every corner, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light in the house turned on, clutching a kitchen knife and waiting for the sun to rise. When morning came, the storm had passed, and the house felt normal, almost like nothing had happened. But as I went to leave for work, something on the front porch caught my eye. There, just below the doorbell, were 3 long scratches etched into the wood. They weren't deep, but they were deliberate, like someone or something had marked the house. And in the dirt by the porch steps, barely visible in the morning light, was a single footprint. It wasn't human. I moved out 2 weeks later. The storm came out of nowhere. One moment, I was sitting in the living room of my parents' lake house, enjoying a quiet evening, and the next, the sky outside turned an ominous shade of greenish-gray. The weather had been mild all day, with nothing more than a light breeze, so I hadn't bothered checking the forecast. That turned out to be a mistake. The lake house is isolated, nestled deep in the woods and perched just above the waterline. It's a beautiful place, but on nights like this, when the wind howls through the trees and the waves crash against the rocks, it can feel like the loneliest spot on earth. The power had flickered a few times before finally going out, leaving me in the glow of the battery-powered lantern I'd found in the closet. The thunder was constant now, rolling through the hills like distant cannon fire. Every few seconds, lightning would light up the lake, casting the forest in stark, skeletal outlines. I tried to keep myself distracted, flipping through an old paperback I'd found on the shelf, but the unease in my chest refused to go away. It wasn't just the storm. It was the feeling that something wasn't right. It started when I noticed the first flash. Not lightning. Something else. I'd been staring at the lake through the picture window when it happened. A faint, pale light flickered deep in the woods, far beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the storm, but then it happened again. A brief flash, barely there, like someone signaling with a flashlight. I told myself it was probably just the reflection of the lightning bouncing off the lake, but as I watched, the flashes became more frequent, and they weren't coming from the lake. They were moving, slowly, steadily, through the forest, growing closer with every flicker. My first thought was that it was a camper or a hiker caught in the storm, maybe trying to find their way back to the main road. But the light wasn't steady, like someone walking with a flashlight. It seemed deliberate, purposeful, almost like it was searching. A bolt of lightning lit up the sky, and for a split second, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the trees. It was too far away to make out clearly, just a dark figure silhouetted against the glowing white of the storm. When the lightning faded, the figure was gone. My stomach churned as I stepped away from the window, the paperback slipping from my hands and hitting the floor with a soft thud. I told myself I was imagining things, that the storm and the darkness were playing tricks on me. But the flashes continued, each one closer than the last. By the time the light reached the clearing just beyond the house, I could feel my hands trembling. I grabbed the lantern and moved to the back of the house, away from the windows, hoping that whoever, or whatever, was out there would pass by without noticing me. The wind howled louder, shaking the walls of the house, and the rain pelted the roof like stones. I sat in the corner of the kitchen, listening to the storm and trying to calm my breathing. Minutes passed, and for a moment, I thought the light had moved on. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but in the silence of the house, it sounded deafening. My blood ran cold as the sound echoed through the kitchen. 3 sharp taps against the back door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The knock came again, louder this time. I forced myself to stand, clutching the lantern like it was a shield, and crept towards the door. The frosted glass window was fogged up from the storm, but I could just make out the shape of a figure standing on the other side. It didn't look like anyone I knew. Not that I was expecting visitors. The outline was too tall, too narrow, its shoulders hunched unnaturally. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no response. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, trying to peer through the glass, but the condensation made it impossible to see clearly. The storm drowned out every sound except the hammering of my heart in my ears. Then, with a flash of lightning, the figure was gone. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty porch. The rain lashed against the glass, and the wind screamed through the trees, but there was no sign of whoever, or whatever, had been knocking. I should have felt relief, but instead, a new fear crept in. The possibility that they hadn't left, but were now somewhere else, somewhere inside. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. If they weren't outside anymore, they could be inside. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned, the lantern casting long, flickering shadows across the kitchen walls. Every sound, the groan of the wind, the creak of the floorboards, felt amplified, like the house itself was alive. I reached for the nearest drawer and pulled it open, my fingers fumbling until they closed around the cold handle of a butcher knife. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Clutching the knife in one hand and the lantern in the other, I started to move through the house. The storm was relentless, each flash of lightning illuminating the rooms for a split second before plunging them back into darkness. I checked every corner, every closet, but everything seemed untouched. Yet, the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. I stopped at the base of the stairs, staring up into the darkness above. The faintest noise drifted down, a creak, like someone shifting their weight. My grip tightened on the knife as I took the first step, the lantern shaking in my hand. The stairs groaned under my weight, every sound echoing like a gunshot. When I reached the top, I paused, listening. The storm outside had reached a crescendo, the thunder rolling so loudly it seemed to shake the house. I took a tentative step towards the first bedroom, the knife raised, and pushed the door open with the tip of the lantern. Empty. The second bedroom was the same, just an unmade bed and the faint smell of cedar from the old dresser. I was starting to think I'd imagined the noise when another creak came, this time from the end of the hall. The master bedroom. I took a deep breath and moved towards the door, the lantern's beam bouncing erratically off the walls. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached the doorway and nudged the door open. The room was pitch black, the windows covered by thick curtains, but as the lightning flashed outside, I saw it. A figure, crouched in the far corner. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, if they were eyes, gleamed faintly in the lantern's light. It didn't move, didn't react, as if it was waiting for something. I stumbled back, the lantern slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The light flickered wildly, casting the figure's shadow across the walls like a grotesque puppet. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Then it stood up. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it knew I couldn't do anything to stop it. It didn't speak, but the air in the room seemed to vibrate, a low hum that resonated deep in my chest. I backed out of the room, my knife trembling in my hand, and as I did, the thing took a step forward. I turned and bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. The lantern's light danced wildly, throwing the house into chaos as I ran for the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, and for a horrifying moment, I thought it wouldn't turn. But then the door flew open, and I stumbled out into the storm. The rain hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran across the yard, towards the tree line, hoping to put as much distance as possible between me and the house. Lightning illuminated the forest in brief, blinding bursts, and every shadow felt like it was moving, following me. I didn't stop until I reached the old logging road that led to the main highway. Only then did I turn back, panting and drenched, to see the house in the distance. It was dark and still, no sign of the figure that had chased me out. But as the lightning flashed one last time, I saw it. standing in the window of the master bedroom, its blank, featureless face turned towards me. The police didn't believe me when I told them what had happened. They chalked it up to stress, maybe a dream brought on by the storm. But when I went back to the house the next day with my dad to pack my things, I found something that confirmed I hadn't imagined it. Scratched into the wood of the master bedroom door, in jagged, uneven letters, were 3 words, "You were warned." I haven't been back to the lake house since. When I moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street, I thought I'd finally found the perfect place. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood was quiet, and the charm of the creaky floorboards and antique fixtures appealed to my love of all things vintage. It was my first time living alone, and I was eager to make the house my own. But there was one thing the landlord failed to mention: the storms. Elm Street seemed to be some kind of lightning magnet. Almost every week, a thunderstorm would roll in, and the lightning would turn the house into a theater of flickering shadows and eerie noises. The first time it happened, I found it oddly exciting, like being in the middle of a dramatic film. But by the 3rd or 4th storm, the novelty had worn off, replaced by a growing unease. It wasn't just the frequency of the storms, it was the way they felt. The air would grow heavy, almost suffocating, and the house would seem to come alive, every creak and groan amplified by the electricity in the air. I started noticing small things. The old radio in the kitchen would crackle with static, even when it was unplugged. Lights would flicker in patterns, almost as if they were trying to communicate. And then there were the voices. The first time I heard them, I was lying in bed, listening to the rain drum against the windows. The power had gone out, leaving the house in complete darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning. I was drifting off to sleep when a faint, crackling sound jolted me awake. It was coming from the direction of the old radio. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But as I lay there, straining to hear, the crackling resolved into something unmistakable. Words, faint, distorted, like a transmission from another time. "Can you hear me?" the voice said, barely audible over the static. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The voice was faint but persistent, repeating the same phrase over and over. I told myself it was just the storm interfering with some stray radio signals, but the radio wasn't plugged in. It wasn't even turned on. I eventually mustered the courage to go downstairs and investigate. The radio sat on the kitchen counter, its dial glowing faintly in the dark. I stared at it, half expecting it to start speaking again, but it remained silent. After a few minutes, I unplugged it entirely and brought it to the garage, shoving it into a box and covering it with an old blanket. That should have been the end of it, but the voices didn't stop. A week later, during another storm, I heard them again, this time coming from the television. The screen was off, but the speakers emitted a low hum, interspersed with faint whispers. I tried ignoring it, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Please, listen," the voice said, crackling with static. I turned the TV on and flipped through the channels, desperate for the noise to stop. Every station was nothing but static, the whispers growing louder with each turn of the dial. I unplugged the TV and sat in silence, the sound of thunder rumbling in the distance. That night, I dreamed of lightning. In the dream, I was standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by a blinding white light. The furniture was gone, and the walls seemed to stretch endlessly upwards. In the center of the room stood a figure, their face obscured by the glow of the lightning. They raised a hand, pointing towards me, and when they spoke, their voice was the same one I'd heard in the static. "You have to leave," they said. "It's not safe." I woke up drenched in sweat, the storm still raging outside. The air in the house felt heavy, suffocating, as if the storm had seeped into the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dream wasn't just a dream, it was a warning. The next day, I found scratches on the walls. They were faint but deliberate, jagged lines carved into the paint near the windows. I tried to convince myself they'd always been there, but deep down, I knew better. Something was in the house, and it wanted me to know it. That evening, as the sun set and the sky darkened, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag, planning to stay at a friend's house until I could figure out what was going on. But as I reached for the front door, a flash of lightning lit up the hallway, and I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, standing at the top of the stairs. The shadow was motionless, but its presence was palpable. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The flash of lightning faded, plunging the hallway into darkness, but the outline of the figure was burned into my vision. I didn't want to look again, but the storm didn't give me a choice. Another flash lit up the house, and this time, the shadow was gone. I clutched the bag tighter and bolted for the front door. My hands fumbled with the lock as the thunder roared outside, but just as I threw the door open, a deafening crash echoed from upstairs. It wasn't thunder, it was something heavy falling. Against my better judgment, I turned to look up the stairs. In the flickering glow of the lightning, I saw the door to the master bedroom swing open. It moved slowly, almost tauntingly, and inside, the darkness seemed to ripple and shift like it was alive. I didn't wait to see more. I ran out into the storm, the wind slamming the door shut behind me. The rain was cold and relentless, soaking me to the bone as I sprinted to my car. I threw my bag into the passenger seat, started the engine, and peeled out of the driveway. My hands trembled on the wheel as I navigated the winding streets, the headlights barely cutting through the sheets of rain. I didn't stop until I reached my friend Rachel's house, a good 20 minutes away. She opened the door in her pajamas, her face a mix of concern and confusion. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. "Are you okay?" she asked, ushering me inside. I told her everything. The voices, the scratches, the shadow. She listened patiently, nodding at all the right moments, but I could tell she thought I was just overtired, maybe stressed from living alone for the first time. "You can crash here tonight," she said, handing me a blanket. "We'll go back tomorrow and check things out in the daylight." I nodded, too exhausted to argue, and curled up on the couch. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow, the glowing radio, and the scratches on the wall. By the time the storm passed and the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. Rachel drove us back to the house that morning. The neighborhood looked deceptively normal in the daylight, the storm having left behind nothing but puddles and damp leaves. But as soon as I stepped inside, the air felt wrong. The house was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain for any sound, any sign of movement. I hesitated in the doorway, my stomach knotting, but Rachel was already moving through the house, her expression curious but unconcerned. "There's nothing here," she said after a few minutes, poking her head out of the kitchen. "It's just an old house. Probably makes a lot of noise during storms." I didn't respond. My eyes were fixed on the staircase, on the faint marks scratched into the wood of the banister. They hadn't been there before. Rachel followed my gaze and frowned. "What are you looking at?" I pointed silently at the scratches, and she stepped closer to inspect them. Her brow furrowed as she traced one of the lines with her finger. "These weren't here last time," she said, her voice hesitant. "Are you sure you're not?" Her words were cut off by the sound of static. We both froze, turning towards the source. It was faint at first, a low hum that seemed to seep from the walls, but it grew louder, filling the house with a crackling, grating noise. It wasn't coming from the old radio or the TV this time. It was everywhere. "Let's go," I said, grabbing her arm. But before we could move, the static resolved into a voice, deep and distorted, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "You shouldn't have come back." The lights flickered violently, and the air seemed to vibrate with the force of the static. Rachel grabbed my hand, and we bolted out of the house, not stopping until we were both in the car with the doors locked. We didn't speak on the drive back to her place. I don't think either of us knew what to say. That afternoon, I called my landlord and broke the lease. I didn't care about the penalties or losing my deposit. I just needed to get out. I never went back to the house, not even to pack. Rachel and a few others gathered my things and left them on her porch for me to pick up. A week later, I got a text from Rachel. It was a picture of a note she'd found wedged under the wipers of her car. The handwriting was jagged, barely legible, but the message was clear. You can't run from the storm. It was supposed to be an ordinary camping trip. My friends and I had been planning it for weeks. A weekend in the mountains, away from the constant buzz of work and responsibilities. There were 4 of us: me, Sarah, Jake, and Marcus. We weren't hardcore adventurers or anything, just a group of co-workers looking to unwind. The weather forecast had warned of possible storms, but we figured we'd be fine. A little rain never hurt anyone, right? Besides, Jake had picked out a campsite that was supposed to be perfect, high ground, close to a clearing, with a view of the valley below. The kind of place you see on postcards. We set up camp on Friday afternoon, pitching 2 tents and gathering wood for a fire. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of mountain air that makes you feel alive. By nightfall, we were sitting around the fire, swapping stories and roasting marshmallows. The storm warnings were the furthest thing from our minds. The first sign of trouble came around midnight. The wind picked up suddenly, sending sparks from the fire swirling into the darkness. Sarah shivered and pulled her jacket tighter. "Feels like something's coming," she said, staring into the woods. Jake waved her off. "It's just the wind. We're on a ridge. Of course it's windy." But I noticed it too. The air had changed. It wasn't just the wind. It was the way the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. A faint rumble of thunder rolled through the valley, and Marcus stood up, glancing at the sky. "Maybe we should call it a night," he said. "If it starts raining, we'll want to be in the tents." We all agreed and doused the fire before retreating to our tents. Jake and Marcus took one, while Sarah and I shared the other. The wind continued to howl as we settled into our sleeping bags, and the occasional flash of lightning lit up the thin fabric of the tent. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to the sound of rain hammering against the tent. The storm had arrived in full force, and the wind was so strong I could feel the tent poles straining against it. I turned to check on Sarah, but she was still asleep, her face buried in her sleeping bag. Then I heard the voice. At first, I thought it was Marcus or Jake, maybe calling out from the other tent, but as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't coming from their direction. It was outside, somewhere near the edge of the clearing. A man's voice, low and steady, speaking words I couldn't make out. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, the flashlight in my hand trembling as I aimed it into the darkness. The rain blurred everything, and the beam of light didn't reach far, but I didn't see anything unusual. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the storm. No response. The voice had stopped. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, telling myself it was just the wind, or maybe the sound of water rushing through the valley. But sleep didn't come easily, and every gust of wind made me jump. The next morning, we woke to find the camp soaked but intact. The storm had passed, leaving behind a damp, eerie silence. Jake and Marcus were already up, inspecting the fire pit, which was little more than a puddle of ash. "Did you guys hear anything last night?" I asked as Sarah and I joined them. Jake shrugged. "Just the storm." "Why?" I hesitated, glancing at the edge of the clearing. "I thought I heard someone talking." "Probably just the wind," Marcus said, though his tone didn't sound convinced. We spent the day hiking and exploring the trails around the campsite, trying to shake the lingering unease. By evening, the clouds had returned, darker and heavier than before. We decided to skip the fire and head to the tents early, just in case the storm came back. This time, I couldn't sleep. The rain started around midnight, and with it came the wind, stronger and colder than the night before. I lay awake, listening to the storm, when the voice returned. It was louder this time, more distinct. A man's voice, calm and deliberate, calling out words I couldn't understand. It sounded closer, like it was just outside the tent. I sat up, my heart racing, and nudged Sarah awake. "Do you hear that?" She blinked groggily and listened. The voice was gone. "You're imagining things," she mumbled, rolling over. But her tone was uneasy. I wasn't imagining it, and I wasn't the only one. The next morning, Marcus and Jake both looked exhausted, and when I asked if they'd slept, Marcus shook his head. "I heard it too," he said. "The voice. It was right outside the tent." The admission from Marcus sent a chill down my spine. Jake, normally the skeptical one, didn't make his usual sarcastic remarks. Instead, he nodded grimly. "It wasn't just the wind," Jake said, staring into the damp ashes of the fire pit. "Someone was out there." None of us wanted to admit how afraid we were, but the tension hung heavy in the air. The storm clouds that had loomed over us since dawn weren't helping. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up again, and the rain began to fall in icy sheets. We retreated to the tents, hoping to wait it out, but the unease was palpable. The storm broke with a vengeance after sundown. Lightning lit up the sky in rapid bursts, each one followed by deafening cracks of thunder. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the tents so violently I thought they might collapse. And through it all, the voice returned. This time, there was no mistaking it. It was deep and resonant, cutting through the storm like a blade. It spoke in a strange, lilting cadence, the words impossible to understand but filled with a terrible authority. It wasn't calling for help. It wasn't lost. It was angry. I gripped my flashlight tightly and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the chaos outside. The rain blurred everything, but in the next flash of lightning, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally so, its elongated limbs silhouetted against the trees. Its face was obscured by the rain, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and oppressive. It stood motionless for a moment, then took a single, deliberate step forward. I scrambled back into the tent, pulling the zipper closed and pressing my back against the far wall. "Sarah," I hissed, shaking her awake. "It's out there." She sat up, her face pale in the dim light of the flashlight. "What's out there?" "I don't know. I saw it. It's not human." Before she could respond, a scream tore through the storm. "Marcus." We bolted out of the tent, the rain and wind hitting us like a wall. Jake and Marcus's tent was collapsed. The poles bent and the fabric flattened against the ground. Jake was nowhere to be seen, but Marcus stood a few feet away, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. He was pointing towards the forest, his hand trembling. It took him," he stammered. "It just grabbed him." "What are you talking about?" I shouted over the wind. "The shadow," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "It came out of nowhere. It pulled him into the trees." I turned towards the forest, my flashlight beam shaking as I swept it over the edge of the clearing. Lightning lit up the scene for a brief moment, and I saw it again. The figure was standing just inside the tree line, taller and more menacing than before. It didn't move, but the storm seemed to intensify around it, as if it were controlling the elements themselves. "Get to the car," I shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Now." Marcus hesitated, his gaze fixed on the forest, but another crash of thunder snapped him out of it. The three of us ran, slipping and stumbling through the mud as we made our way down the trail towards the parking lot. The storm seemed to follow us, the wind tearing at our clothes and the rain blinding us with every step. When we finally reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. We piled in, slamming the doors shut, and I started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty trail ahead. But as I shifted into drive, Sarah gasped. It was standing in the middle of the road. The figure loomed in the beams of the headlights, its shadow stretching impossibly far behind it. Its face, or where its face should have been, was featureless, a smooth, pale void that seemed to absorb the light. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at us. "Drive!" Sarah screamed, and I floored the accelerator. The car surged forward, but the figure didn't move. It didn't even flinch as we barreled towards it. At the last second, I swerved, narrowly missing it, and the car skidded onto the muddy trail. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept driving until we were miles away, the storm finally fading behind us. We reported Jake's disappearance to the authorities, but the search turned up nothing. No sign of him, no sign of the figure. The campsite was destroyed, the tents shredded and the ground churned up as if by a tornado, but there were no tracks, no clues. Weeks later, I got a call from Marcus. He hadn't been sleeping. Neither had I. He told me he'd been dreaming about the figure, about its blank face and its long, reaching arms. "It's still out there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And it's waiting." That was the last time I ever went camping.